In the charged silence of the Fulton County Courthouse, Judge Harlan Beck's voice sliced through the air like a blade. "Are you deaf, or simply incapable of understanding basic English, Miss Voss?" he sneered, his heavy gavel striking the bench with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. "People like you walk into my courtroom believing the law will bend to your ignorance. It will not. Pay the fine now, or I will have the bailiff put you in a holding cell." Elena Voss did not flinch. She simply looked back at him with a calm, unnerving smile. Judge Beck thought he was putting a powerless black woman in her place. He had no idea that the woman standing before him held the power to destroy his entire career. Outside, the thick, suffocating humidity of an Atlanta summer pressed against the glass doors. But inside, courtroom 4B, the air felt cold and sharp. It was one of those mornings when the docket overflowed with minor civil disputes, traffic infractions, and code violations. The worn gallery benches were packed with restless citizens who shifted in their seats, checked their watches, and whispered quiet prayers. At the front of the room, elevated like a monarch on a mahogany throne, sat Superior Court Judge Harlan Beck. He wore his 58 years with aggressive arrogance, his face flushed from years of rich meals and aged scotch at his private club. To him, the bench was not a place of blind justice. It was his personal stage, where he reigned as the undisputed star of his own small kingdom, protected by old connections and powerful friends. Sitting quietly in the third row was Elena Voss. Anyone who looked closely might have noticed the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes, but no one looked closely. That was exactly how she wanted it. Today she had left behind her usual tailored suits and commanding presence. Instead, she wore a faded gray cardigan, a plain white blouse, a modest black skirt, scuffed loafers, and wire-rimmed glasses that softened her cheekbones. Her natural hair was pulled back into a simple, severe bun. She looked ordinary. She looked tired. She looked perfectly, wonderfully vulnerable. For hours, she had sat motionless, watching Judge Beck work. It was worse than she had imagined. She watched him verbally tear apart a young, stuttering public defender, rolling his eyes and sighing loudly into the microphone. She watched him cut off a Hispanic mother mid-sentence as she tried to translate a housing document for her son, barking at her to speak English or leave. She watched him share a quiet joke with a wealthy corporate lawyer and grant a motion to dismiss without even glancing at the opposing papers. He was everything the rumors claimed: biased, cruel, impatient, and deeply prejudiced. Elena was not there by accident. The plain manila folder on her lap contained the details of a carefully constructed case, Voss versus Oakage Estates Homeowners Association. It was a fabricated low-level dispute over a property boundary designed specifically to place her in Judge Beck's path. As the morning wore on, she reflected on the road that had brought her here. She understood the law down to its core. A summa cum laude graduate of Emory University Law School, she had spent a decade fighting civil rights cases before being appointed to a far greater responsibility. But to Judge Beck, scanning the sea of faces before him, she was simply another name on a crowded docket, another nuisance to be brushed aside. The clerk's voice rang out over the speakers. Case number 22-CV-499, Voss versus Oakage Estates Homeowners Association. Parties, please step forward. Elena took a slow, deep breath. She let the nervousness of the room settle into her posture, rounding her shoulders and keeping her head slightly bowed as she stood. She clutched her manila folder tightly to her chest, playing the part of the intimidated citizen to perfection. From the other side of the aisle rose Preston Hale, a 60-something attorney with a slicked-back comb-over and an expensive custom suit. He was a known figure in Fulton County, a high-priced bully who specialized in intimidating homeowners on behalf of wealthy HOAs. More importantly, he was one of Judge Beck's regular golf partners. They shared the same arrogant sense of entitlement. Elena walked down the center aisle, feeling the heavy silence of the courtroom press in around her. She approached the plaintiff's podium, her flat shoes barely making a sound on the polished floor. Judge Beck did not look up. He was busy signing orders, his gold fountain pen scratching loudly across the paper. He let them stand there for a long, uncomfortable stretch of silence, a deliberate power move meant to make litigants feel small. Finally, he capped his pen, leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, and peered down over his half-moon reading glasses. His eyes drifted over Preston Hale with a slight nod of recognition before settling heavily on Elena. The judge's upper lip curled into the faintest sneer. He took in her faded cardigan, her lack of legal representation, and her quiet demeanor. He saw exactly what he wanted to see: a victim. He had no idea the trap had already closed around him. "All right, let's get this over with," Judge Beck grumbled into his microphone, his gravelly voice commanding instant obedience. He squinted at the docket sheet and deliberately mispronounced her name. "Elena Voss, is that you?" "It's Elena, Your Honor," she corrected gently, her voice soft but steady. "Pro se?" He let out a loud, derisive snort that echoed through the speakers. He glanced at Preston Hale with a conspiratorial smirk. "How marvelous. Another amateur hour. Miss Voss, are you aware of what pro se even means, or did you hear it on some television show?" "It means I am representing myself, Your Honor," Elena replied, keeping her expression perfectly blank. "It means," the judge corrected sharply, pointing a thick finger at her, "that you are wasting my court's valuable time because you were too cheap or too stubborn to hire a real attorney. This is not a town hall meeting, young lady. This is a court of law, and I expect you to follow the rules of civil procedure, though I highly doubt you even know what civil procedure is." Preston Hale chuckled from the defense podium. "Your Honor, if I may," he said smoothly, "the HOA is simply asking the court to enforce a standard property line violation. Ms. Voss has erected a fence that violates the bylaws. It is a straightforward matter that should not take more than a few minutes of the court's time." "I agree, Mr. Hale," Judge Beck said, his tone instantly softening into something almost conversational. "It seems fairly cut and dried. Ms. Voss, why exactly are you contesting this? Did you or did you not read the HOA bylaws before moving into that neighborhood?" "I did read them, Your Honor," Elena said, shifting her weight slightly and opening her folder. "In fact, I have a copy right here. According to Section 4, Paragraph B." "I don't need you to read the bylaws to me, girl," Judge Beck snapped. The word girl landed with a harsh, derogatory edge. The courtroom went dead silent. A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. In the South, calling a grown black woman girl carried a long, ugly history of condescension. Elena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she did not break character. "Keep talking, Harlan," she thought. "Give me everything I need." "Your Honor," she continued, her voice still politely deferential, "I only bring up Section 4 because the fence in question was actually constructed by the previous owner years earlier, which places it outside the statute of limitations for HOA enforcement under Georgia law." "Oh Lord, save me from Wikipedia lawyers," Judge Beck interrupted loudly, throwing his hands up in mock exasperation. He looked out at the gallery, playing to his audience. "You people come in here, read one paragraph on the internet, and suddenly you think you're Clarence Darrow. Let me explain something to you, Miss Voss, in words simple enough for you to understand." He leaned aggressively over the bench, glaring down at her. "I don't care what you think Georgia law says. I care about the facts. The fact is, you are in violation. People from your background always seem to think the rules don't apply to them. You move into a nice, respectable neighborhood like Oakage and immediately try to bring a Section 8 mentality into it. Well, not in my county, and certainly not in my courtroom. At the defense table, Preston Hale looked slightly uncomfortable. Even for him, this was pushing into blatant, actionable prejudice. But he said nothing, unwilling to risk the judge who regularly ruled in his favor. Elena felt a cold, hard knot of satisfaction form in her chest. There it is, she thought. The overt racism, the assumption about her economic status, the raw, unfiltered bias. Every word was being captured on the official record. She glanced at the court reporter, a young woman named Lila, whose fingers were flying across the stenograph machine. "Your Honor," Elena said, her voice dropping slightly, losing some of its artificial timidity. "Are you implying that my race or my perceived background has some bearing on the legality of a property dispute?" Judge Beck's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. No pro se litigant had ever dared question him like this. "What I am implying, Miss Voss, is that you are out of your depth, out of your league, and out of order. You will stand there. You will keep your mouth shut, and you will speak only when spoken to. Do you understand me?" "I'm simply trying to present my evidence, Your Honor," Elena replied calmly. "Your evidence is garbage," Judge Beck bellowed, slamming his hand flat against the mahogany bench. "I am the judge here. I decide what the law is in this room, and I have had just about enough of your insolence." He turned to Preston Hale. "Mr. Hale, what is your motion?" "We are seeking an order for the immediate removal of the fence, Your Honor, as well as an award of attorney's fees in the amount of $5,000 due to the frivolous nature of Miss Voss's defense," Preston Hale said smoothly, recovering his smirk. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. $5,000 for a minor fence dispute was an exorbitant, punishing sum clearly meant to crush a working-class citizen. "Granted," Judge Beck said immediately, without even looking at the paperwork. "Objection, Your Honor," Elena stated firmly. "The plaintiff has not submitted any billing records to justify an award of $5,000 in attorney's fees. Furthermore, ruling without allowing me to present my defense is a violation of my right to due process." Judge Beck slowly picked up his gavel. His eyes were wide with a terrifying, unhinged fury. He pointed the wooden handle directly at Elena's face. "Miss Voss, you are standing on the very edge of a precipice," he hissed, his voice vibrating with rage. "One more word out of your mouth, one single syllable, and I will find you in direct criminal contempt of court. I will have the bailiff put you in handcuffs right now, and you can spend the next 48 hours in the Fulton County Jail thinking about your attitude. Do I make myself absolutely clear?" The courtroom felt as though all the oxygen had been sucked out of it. The bailiff standing near the jury box shifted his weight, resting his hand on his utility belt. In the gallery, several people physically recoiled from the sheer force of the judge's outburst. Elena stood at the podium, surrounded by the threat of immediate incarceration. For a fleeting second, the image of cold steel handcuffs snapping around her wrists flashed through her mind. But she did not step back. She did not lower her eyes. She looked directly into Judge Beck's bloodshot, furious gaze and offered a serene, almost pitying smile. "I understand you perfectly, Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying a chilling, quiet authority that seemed utterly out of place for a pro se litigant in a faded cardigan. "I just want to ensure that the record reflects your ruling accurately." She turned her head slowly toward the court reporter. "Lila, did you get all of that? The judge's comments regarding my background, the Section 8 mentality, and his refusal to allow me to present evidence before ruling?" The young court reporter swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously between Elena and the apoplectic judge. She nodded weakly. "Yes, ma'am, it's on the record." Judge Beck exploded. He slammed the gavel down with a deafening crack. "That's it!" he roared, spit flying across the bench. "Bailiff, take her into custody!" "Your Honor, if I may," Preston Hale suddenly interrupted, panic bleeding into his polished voice. He was a predator, but he was a smart one. Something about the way Elena stood, the absolute lack of fear in her eyes, the deliberate way she checked with the court reporter, sent a cold shiver down his spine. It felt wrong. It felt like a trap. "Your Honor," he pleaded quickly, "the HOA would be satisfied with just the order to remove the fence. We can waive the attorney's fees to expedite the matter and clear your docket." Judge Beck paused, his chest heaving under his black robes. He glared at Preston Hale, furious at the interruption, but he caught the desperate warning in his friend's eyes. He looked back at Elena, who stood with her hands clasped elegantly in front of her, waiting patiently to be arrested. The judge gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw jumping. He wanted to throw her in a cell more than anything, but the promise of clearing his docket won out. "Fine," he spat, throwing his pen down. "Consider yourself incredibly lucky, little lady. Mr. Hale has shown you a mercy you do not deserve. The court orders the immediate removal of the fence. Case closed. Get out of my courtroom before I change my mind." "Thank you, Your Honor," Elena said. She did not sound relieved. She sounded victorious. She meticulously placed her papers back into her manila folder, closed it, and tucked it under her arm. She looked up at Judge Beck one last time. "Have a wonderful afternoon, Judge Beck. I'm quite certain we will be seeing each other again very soon." He scoffed and turned his attention away. "I highly doubt that. Next case." Elena turned and walked up the center aisle. The people in the gallery parted for her slightly, looking at her with a mixture of awe and pity. They thought she had just survived a brush with destruction. They had no idea she had just orchestrated an execution. She pushed through the heavy wooden double doors of courtroom 4B and stepped out into the bustling hallway. The moment the doors clicked shut behind her, her posture transformed. The artificial timidity evaporated. Her shoulders snapped back, her spine straightened. The weary, intimidated Sadyo citizen was gone, replaced instantly by a woman of supreme, terrifying power. She reached into her plain black tote bag, pulled out her cell phone, and dialed a secure number. "Julian," she said, her voice crisp and commanding, entirely different from the soft tone she had used inside. "Chairwoman Voss," came the deep professional voice of Julian Crow, her chief investigator. "How was your morning at the theater?" "Illuminating," Elena replied, striding confidently past a group of arguing lawyers who instinctively moved out of her way. "He gave us everything. The racial bias, the denial of due process, the threats of retaliatory contempt, the inappropriate relationship with opposing counsel. It's a gold mine." "Did he suspect anything?" Julian asked. "Not a thing. His ego blinded him completely," Elena said, pushing open the heavy glass exit doors and stepping out into the blistering Atlanta heat. "I want you to subpoena the official transcript from courtroom 4B immediately. Have the court reporter, Lila, sign a sworn affidavit authenticating the audio backup. I don't want him having a chance to alter the record. Consider it done, Elena. I'll have the file on your desk by mid-afternoon." "Good," Elena said, her eyes narrowing behind her wire-rimmed glasses as she walked toward the secure judge's parking lot. "Draft the formal articles of disciplinary action. It's time to take out the trash." 2 miles away from the grimy floors of the Fulton County Courthouse sat the gleaming, ultra-modern glass tower of the State Bar of Georgia. On the top floor, behind heavy frosted glass doors, lay the highly secretive offices of the Georgia Judicial Qualifications Commission. The JQC was the ultimate authority for every judge in the state, an independent body with the power to investigate, discipline, and ultimately remove corrupt, incompetent, or biased judges from the bench. For years, the JQC had been considered toothless, a rubber stamp committee run by political insiders who protected their own. That changed when a new chairwoman was appointed. Elena Voss walked into the executive suite, shedding her gray cardigan and tossing it into a trash can by the door. She unlocked her private office, a spacious room with panoramic views of the Atlanta skyline, and walked over to her mahogany desk. A sleek silver plaque sat on the edge. Elena Voss, Esquire, Chairwoman, Judicial Qualifications Commission. She was not just a lawyer. She was a legal prodigy. After graduating at the top of her class at Emory, she had earned a Master of Laws from Harvard. She had spent her entire career quietly dismantling corrupt institutions, and now she had the mandate and the power to clean up the Georgia judiciary. Julian Crow walked into her office carrying a thick bound document. He dropped it onto her desk with a heavy thud. "The official transcript from courtroom 4B, he said, crossing his arms. "I read it on the drive over. Elena, it's worse than we thought. Reading it is one thing, but listening to the audio, the sheer vitriol in his voice, he practically lynched you from the bench." Elena flipped open the transcript. Her eyes scanned the lines. "Girl. Section 8 mentality. People from your background." Seeing the words in black and white made her blood run cold, but it also fueled the righteous fire burning in her chest. "We've had over 20 anonymous complaints about Judge Beck in the last 3 years, she said softly, tracing her finger over his horrific quotes. "Complaints from public defenders, pro se litigants, even a few courageous court clerks. They all alleged racism, sexism, and gross abuse of power. But because they were mostly poor minorities, the previous JQC board dismissed them as unsubstantiated. They were terrified of him," Julian noted. "Beck is heavily connected. He plays golf with state senators. He's untouchable." "No one is untouchable," Elena corrected, her eyes flashing with dangerous intensity. She looked up at Julian. "Tell me about his current political ambitions. I know he's not satisfied with Superior Court." Julian pulled a tablet from his jacket. "That's where the timing gets interesting. Beck is currently the front-runner to fill a vacant seat on the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, a lifetime federal appointment. Word is that the announcement is expected soon. He's been heavily lobbying the political establishment. He thinks he's a shoo-in." Elena leaned back in her high-backed leather chair, steepling her fingers beneath her chin. A slow, predatory smile spread across her face. Judge Harlan Beck was standing on the absolute precipice of his career, about to achieve his lifelong dream of ultimate, unaccountable, federal power. "Let him dream," Elena whispered. "Let him think he's won. The higher he climbs, the harder the fall." "So, what's the play?" Julian asked, leaning over the desk. "We bypass the preliminary investigation," Elena instructed, her voice all business. "We have direct eyewitness testimony, mine. We have the authenticated, unedited transcript. We have the audio. I want you to prepare a notice of formal proceedings. Charge him with violations of the Code of Judicial Conduct, Rule 1.2, failure to promote confidence in the judiciary. Rule 2.3, manifesting bias and prejudice. And Rule 2.8, failure to be patient, dignified, and courteous to litigants." Julian nodded, taking rapid notes. "When do we serve him?" "He's attending a major social event at the Piedmont Driving Club soon," Elena said, pulling up his itinerary on her computer. "He'll be celebrating his impending federal nomination surrounded by his admirers. We wait until after that. Let him have his moment of glory. Then, we serve him with a mandatory summons for an emergency disciplinary hearing. Give him exactly 48 hours to appear before the full commission." "He's going to lawyer up," Julian warned. "He'll hire Richard Vail, the best defense attorney in the state for this kind of case." "Let him," Elena said coldly. No lawyer in the world can unring this bell, especially when the star witness is the judge of judges. The Piedmont Driving Club was the heart of Atlanta's old money and political elite, a place of dark oak paneling, crystal chandeliers, and cigar smoke, where deals were made and careers were crowned in quiet whispers over expensive bourbon. That evening, Judge Harlan Beck was the undisputed king of the ballroom. Dressed in a bespoke tuxedo, holding a tumbler of 20-year-old Macallan, he held court among state senators, corporate lobbyists, and high-powered attorneys. Preston Hale stood by his side, laughing too loudly at Beck's jokes. "I'm telling you, the 11th Circuit doesn't know what's coming," a state senator chuckled, clapping Beck heavily on the shoulder. "We finally get a strict constitutionalist up there, someone who doesn't put up with this modern liberal nonsense in the courtroom." "Well, you know me, Senator," Beck beamed, his face flushed with alcohol and boundless ego. "I run a tight ship. I don't let these pro-C clowns or activist lawyers waste the taxpayers' time. You have to put the fear of God into them early, otherwise they run all over you." He took a long sip of his scotch, feeling utterly invincible. He was days away from a federal robe, a lifetime appointment. He would never have to answer to local voters or petty county politics ever again. He was a god among men. Across the ballroom, standing near a towering ice sculpture, Elena Voss watched him. She wore a stunning floor-length emerald gown, her hair elegantly styled, a diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. She looked like royalty. Several men had tried to approach her, but the sheer force of her presence kept them at bay. Beck's eyes briefly swept the room and landed on her. For a fraction of a second, his brow furrowed. There was something familiar about the shape of her face, the intensity of her stare. But his alcohol-soaked brain, conditioned to categorize people by their immediate utility and appearance, completely failed to connect the dazzling, powerful woman in the emerald gown with the timid cardigan-wearing woman he had verbally abused in his courtroom days earlier. He offered her a sleazy, appreciative wink, raised his glass in her direction, and turned back to his sycophants. Elena's smile was razor-thin. She turned and walked out of the ballroom, stepping into the cool night air. Her work here was done. The stage was set. Days later, Judge Beck was sitting in his chambers behind courtroom 4B, sipping black coffee and reviewing his docket, when his secretary nervously knocked on the heavy wooden door. "Come in, Martha." "What is it?" Beck barked. Not looking up, Martha, a woman who had worked for him for 10 years and feared him deeply, stepped into the room holding a thick sealed envelope stamped with the state seal of Georgia. Her hands were shaking visibly. "Judge, a courier just dropped this off. It's marked strictly confidential. Personal service required." Beck frowned, finally looking up. He snatched the envelope from her trembling hands and tore it open. He pulled out the heavy watermarked paper. His eyes scanned the header. Judicial Qualifications Commission of the State of Georgia. Notice of formal proceedings and mandatory summons. Beck rolled his eyes, letting out a heavy sigh of annoyance. Unbelievable. Some disgruntled loser from traffic court filed a grievance. These JQC bureaucrats have nothing better to do than harass hard-working judges. He skimmed down the page, expecting some minor complaint about scheduling or a rude tone. But as his eyes absorbed the text, the color rapidly drained from his face. Violation of Rule 1.2. Violation of Rule 2.3. Manifesting bias and prejudice based on race and socioeconomic status. Violation of Rule 2.8. He flipped to the second page. Incident reported. Voss versus Oakage Estates. Courtroom 4B. Beck's stomach did a violent flip. The pro-C woman. The one with the fence. He remembered his words. He remembered calling her girl. He remembered the Section 8 comment. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. This was not a minor complaint. This was a full-scale formal proceeding. "Martha!" Beck yelled, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "Get Richard Vale on the phone right now. Cancel my morning docket. Tell them I have a judicial emergency." 30 minutes later, Richard Vale, the most feared defense attorney for judicial misconduct in the South, was sitting across from Beck in his chambers. Vale read the summons, his face grim. "Harlan, this is bad," he said, tossing the document onto the desk. "They're not asking for a written response. They are ordering you to appear before the full 6-member JQC panel soon. That means they think they have a smoking gun. They want your head." "It's a misunderstanding," Beck stammered, pacing frantically around the room. The invincible aura from the gala had vanished completely. The woman was uncooperative. She was trying to play lawyer. I lost my temper for a second. It happens to everyone." "You called a black litigant girl on the record, Harlan," Vale said coldly. "And you made disparaging remarks about low-income housing. The new Jouti chairwoman, Elena Voss, was appointed specifically to clean up this kind of old-school Southern prejudice. She is a crusader. She's not going to let this go with a slap on the wrist. She's going to try to strip your robe." Beck grabbed his hair, his mind racing. The federal nomination. If the White House caught wind of a JQC formal investigation, his nomination would be dead before it even reached the Senate floor. He had to kill this quickly. "So what do we do, Richard? I can't lose the 11th Circuit over some nobody with a fence. We go in, and you act like the most humble, repentant man on God's green earth," Vale instructed firmly. "We argue that you were exhausted, suffering from a medical issue, maybe high blood pressure, medication side effects. We apologize profusely. We offer to take sensitivity training. We throw ourselves on the mercy of the panel. But whatever you do, Harlan, do not act arrogant. If you go in there acting like you own the place, Chairwoman Voss will bury you alive." Beck swallowed hard, nodding rapidly. "Okay, humble, repentant. I can do that. I can handle a panel of bureaucrats." But deep down, a terrible, creeping dread had taken root in his soul. For the first time in his professional life, Judge Harlan Beck was terrified. The boardroom of the Judicial Qualifications Commission was designed to be intimidating. It was entirely windowless, paneled in dark acoustic wood, dominated by a massive semicircular mahogany desk where the 6 commissioners sat. It felt less like a conference room and more like an execution chamber. Judge Beck sat at the respondents' table, dwarfed by the room's imposing architecture. He wore his most conservative navy suit, his hands folded neatly in front of him, trying to project an aura of somber respect. Next to him, Richard Vale reviewed his defense notes, his jaw set tightly. The heavy doors at the back of the room opened, and 5 of the 6 panel members filed in, a mix of appellate judges, prominent attorneys, and civilian appointees. They took their seats in absolute silence, their faces grim and unreadable. They did not look at Beck. The center chair, the seat of the chairwoman, remained empty. "Where is she?" Beck whispered to his lawyer, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple. "Playing psychological games." "Quiet," Vale hissed back. "Don't give them a reason to scowl." Finally, the side door connected to the executive offices clicked open. The room collectively held its breath as the chairwoman entered. She wore a razor-sharp, double-breasted charcoal suit. Her hair was styled immaculately. She carried a thick black binder, which she set down on the center desk with a heavy, authoritative thud. Judge Beck looked up. He expected to see an older, gray-haired political operative. Instead, he saw the woman in the emerald gown from the gala. And then, as she adjusted her glasses and looked directly down at him, reality slammed into him with the force of a freight train. The wire-rimmed glasses, the sharp cheekbones, the dark, assessing eyes. The faded gray cardigan vanished from his memory, replaced by the terrifying, undeniable truth. The woman sitting in the chairwoman's seat, the woman holding absolute power over his career, his pension, and his future, was the pro-se nobody he had humiliated in his courtroom days earlier. Elena Voss. Beck let out a strangled gasp, a sound caught halfway between a cough and a whimper. He grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white as the blood drained entirely from his face. The room began to spin. His heart hammered wildly against his ribs. "Harlan, what is it? Are you having a heart attack?" Vale whispered urgently, seeing his client's sudden physical collapse. Beck could not speak. He could only point a trembling finger at the chairwoman. Vale looked up. He looked at Elena Voss. Then he looked at the case file. Voss versus Oakage Estates. Then he looked back at the chairwoman. Vale, a veteran of 1,000 legal battles, physically slumped in his chair. He closed his eyes and let out a long, defeated exhale. He knew instantly that the case was over. There was no defense. There was no plea deal. They had walked blindly into an ambush of apocalyptic proportions. Elena Voss did not gloat. She did not smirk. She simply opened her binder, pressed the button on her microphone, and looked down at the trembling, broken man before her. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, her voice echoing with crystal clarity through the silent room. "This panel is hereby called to order. We are here to address the formal disciplinary charges against Superior Court Judge Harlan Beck." Beck tried to speak, his voice reduced to a pathetic squeak. "Ms. Voss, Chairwoman, I didn't know." "You didn't know what, Judge Beck?" Elena cut in, her voice slicing through his stammering like a scalpel. "That the woman standing before you in your courtroom was the chairwoman of this commission? Is that the prerequisite for being treated with basic human dignity in your courtroom? Must a citizen hold high office to avoid being subjected to your racial animus?" No, Your Honor, I was having a terrible day. My blood pressure." "Save it," Elena commanded, her tone dropping to a dangerous freezing register. She picked up a sheet of paper. "Let us dispense with the theater. I am not going to ask you to explain your actions, Judge Beck, because your own words have already provided all the explanation this panel requires." She picked up the authenticated transcript. She began to read. She read his words exactly as he had spoken them, but stripped of the booming theatrical courtroom echo. In the sterile, quiet boardroom, his quotes sounded even more horrific, even more venomous. "Did you even graduate high school, Miss Voss? People from your background always seem to think the rules don't apply to them. You try to bring a Section 8 mentality into it. One more word, and I will have my bailiff put you in handcuffs." Every time she read a quote, Beck flinched as if he were being physically struck. The other panel members glared at him with open, unmasked disgust. Elena set the transcript down. She looked into Beck's terrified, pleading eyes. "For the record, Judge Beck," she said slowly, every syllable dripping with calculated destruction. "I did graduate high school. I then graduated summa cum laude from Emory University Law School. I then earned my Master of Laws from Harvard. But my education is not what is on trial here today, and neither is my background. What is on trial is your fundamental fitness to wear the robe and serve the citizens of Georgia, a trust you have utterly, disgustingly violated." "Chairwoman, please," Vale intervened, trying desperately to salvage his client. "My client is deeply remorseful. He's prepared to tender a formal apology, undergo rigorous bias training, and subject himself to a probationary period." "Mr. Vale," Elena interrupted softly, "do not insult my intelligence or the intelligence of this panel. We all know that if I had truly been a pro-se litigant working a minimum wage job, Judge Beck would not be remorseful today. He would have fined me $5,000, laughed about it at his country club, and moved on to his federal appointment." At the mention of the federal appointment, Beck buried his face in his hands, letting out a low, pathetic sob. This panel has also reviewed the 22 previous complaints filed against you, Judge Beck. Elena continued, signaling the final blow, which detail a distinct, undeniable pattern of discriminatory behavior toward minorities, women, and low-income litigants. She looked at her fellow panel members. They all nodded in grim unison. The Judicial Qualifications Commission of Georgia finds that you have committed egregious, indefensible violations of the Code of Judicial Conduct, Elena declared, her voice ringing with the heavy finality of a gavel striking wood. We are unanimously recommending to the Georgia Supreme Court immediate permanent removal from the bench. Beck gasped for air, his career dissolving into ash before his eyes. Furthermore, Elena added, her eyes locked onto his, this commission is forwarding the authenticated transcripts and audio recordings of your racist conduct directly to the White House counsel's office and to the Senate Judiciary Committee. It was a total unmitigated slaughter. The fallout was catastrophic, immediate, and painfully public. Within days of the JQC's unanimous recommendation, the transcripts of Voss versus Oakage Estates were leaked to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. The headline splashed across the Sunday edition was brutal. Section 8 mentality. Atlanta judge faces ouster after racist tirade against undercover JQ chairwoman. The internet exploded. The audio recording captured by the court reporter's backup system went viral on every social media platform. Millions of people listened to Judge Harlan Beck's arrogant, venomous voice as he tried to destroy a woman he thought was powerless. The political abandonment was instantaneous. The state senators and wealthy lobbyists who had clapped him on the back at the Piedmont Driving Club suddenly pretended they had never met him. Preston Hale, desperate to save his own law firm's reputation, gave a public statement condemning Beck's shocking and unacceptable language. The White House, terrified of the PR nightmare, pulled Beck's nomination for the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals before the sun even set, facing inevitable impeachment by the state legislature and formal disbarment. Harlan Beck had only one option left. In the weeks that followed the incident in courtroom 4B, he submitted a humiliating one-sentence letter of resignation to the governor. He was stripped of his title, his power, and, due to a specific clause in Georgia law regarding resignation under severe disciplinary investigation, a significant portion of his lucrative state pension, he became a pariah, a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of law schools. Months later, Elena Voss sat in her office overlooking the Atlanta skyline. The JQC had teeth now. The judges of Georgia knew that the era of the Old Boys Network was dead and buried. They knew that behind any pro se litigant, behind any quiet citizen in the back of the courtroom, the eyes of true justice might be watching. Julian Crow walked in, dropping a fresh stack of files on her desk. He looked at the empty spot on the wall, where they used to keep the tracking board for Judge Beck. I heard Beck is trying to open a small private practice in the suburbs, Julian mentioned, smirking slightly. Turns out nobody wants to hire a disgraced, racist former judge to represent them. He's practically bankrupt. Elena did not smile. She just looked out the window at the sprawling city below. She did not take joy in the destruction of Harlan Beck's life. She simply saw it as the necessary removal of a toxin from the justice system. Karma wasn't just a mystical force. Sometimes karma wore a faded gray cardigan, stood quietly at a podium, and let arrogance dig its own inescapable grave. Elena picked up her pen, pulled the first file from the new stack, and got back to work. There was still justice to be done. This is the remarkable story of how one arrogant judge's monstrous ego blinded him to the trap that ended his entire career. Judge Beck thought he was the smartest, most powerful man in the room, but he learned the hard way that true power doesn't need to shout, and karma never misses its target. If you loved this story of absolute justice and satisfying karma, please like it. It truly helps the channel grow. Share this with anyone who needs a reminder that arrogance always leads to a downfall. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our dramatic stories of justice and redemption. What would you have done if you were in Elena's shoes? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.